This session is much more interactive, and it's about the After Disasters Network that is part of the IHRR. I'm not going to say anything else. I'm going to ask Kate Cochrane to present the After Disasters Network and to start the next part of our session.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for staying. Normally we get given the shift that's directly after lunch when everybody's having their nap. But at least we've got people in the room. For the people who are on screens, we've got people in the room. They're not looking that asleep. I don't have to find things to throw at people, and I haven't yet made them stand up and jump up and down, although I might, just as a hint. Just let people know about the After Disasters Network. So the After Disasters Network is something that emerged from our experiences. There's a few of us. So there's myself. I'm Kate Cochrane, Head of Resilience for NHS Highland. I was Emergency Planning Manager for the Falkland Islands Government, and before that I was one of the resilience planners at Newcastle City Council. I've been involved with IHRR since 2007, so a very long time. We're blaming Ben Anderson for many things in this world. So there's myself, there's my colleague Neil Denton, who'll be presenting after me. We're doing a hybrid presentation. So Neil is at home with COVID. I'm in the building, hopefully not with COVID. And after do my slides, we will seamlessly transfer so that Neil will have his slides and will complete the presentation. If this works, I recommend we all go out and buy lottery tickets. So Neil is a community mediator. I worked with him in Newcastle, and probably in and around, again, probably around 2007, 2008, we started to think about Neil's work in community mediation, in conflict management, how actually it was really very similar to the work that I did. But he did community mediation and conflict management all of the time because there's always a need for that. But my work only happened every so often. So we started to have a think about this is really interesting. There's some real likenesses here. Time moved on. Professionally, we developed our careers. And bad things happened. So if we look at the slide that we've got up here at the moment, the picture on the, she's standing in front of it, on the right-hand side, where we've got some concrete pilings underneath a block of flats and some water coming behind it. Just like to say that's not a very extravagant water feature. That's the waterfall that was developed after Thunder Thursday and some flats in Newburn, in Newcastle. Those particular blocks of flats, people had to be evacuated overnight. There was a culvert had collapsed, the water backed up, the water came over the top and literally washed away the foundations. That community was living with increased flood risk for about 18 months. At one point, that community was on a 15-minute notice to move. That if it started to rain, they literally had 15 minutes to get their gear, pick themselves up and get out of their homes. Neil and I worked very closely in how we spoke with that community about the risks, how we heard their frustrations, how we heard their anger, and how we hopefully helped them manage that anger in ways that didn't create increased division in the communities, but helped to respect the other work that was going on. The rowboat at the top, one of my other colleagues as part of the After Disaster Network is Lucy Easthope. Lucy, a shameless plug for Lucy is she's got a book out at the moment called When the Dust Settles, a disaster management book that made the Sunday Times bestseller list. Who knew that would happen? So Lucy's been working in disaster management for a long time, and her primary area of work is mass fatalities, disaster victim identification, and what do we do with the bricolage of the dead? So if we think about what happens after air crashes, she was involved in the management of the mortuaries after the Indian Ocean tsunami. What happens to the things that are left behind? How do we look at them? How do we manage them? How do we give them back to families and loved ones? How do we manage the bricolage of the dead? We've then got the one underneath that, we've got the ship on its side. I was incredibly fortunate in that I was out working with communities in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. What was it like to live in those communities after the disaster? What decisions did we make before the disaster that made that disaster 10 times worse? We've then got the picture on the bottom, and you'll see what looks like a series of a series of burnt-out rail cars, because that's what they are. This is from a place called Lac-Mégantic in Canada. And the leader, the person who led the response to Lac-Mégantic is a lady called Melissa Généraux. She was Director of Public Health at the time. She'd been in post 3 days when a very long train carrying crude oil went down into the town of Lac-Mégantic, derailed and exploded. It's one of the best ways I've seen about managing that after-disaster space. But all of us came together in Grenfell, and that's where we met Flora Cornish. So Flora does very hard sums methodology. She does really hard maths, she does really hard processes, and literally we do the, yes, Flora, that's what it is that we will do. And so between all of us, we all bring different things to it. I bring the fact that I work in disaster management, I work with communities. I find the entire world of disaster management and disaster response endlessly fascinating. And one of the things that we found was that when we were talking to people about disasters, it was all about perspective. Now, I'd just like this is one of my most favourite maps in the world. Because when you think about it, this is the way around the world should be, isn't it? You think everything's dropped to the bottom. But it takes some doing to start to get your head around, actually, where are the countries if things are switched around? So when we're thinking about what is after disasters, we need to be really certain about the perspective that we're coming from. So let's think about this. We've got something bad has happened. We've got this amorphous badness. I'm not going to go into the intricacies of, is it a hazard, so something that's caused, something that's natural in origin? Is it a threat, something that somebody has purposefully done? What we have is we've got this bad thing that's happening. Now, if you're sat at home, and I was so pleased when my County Durham colleague also referenced Mrs. Cannybody, because Mrs. Cannybody's the person that gets me out of bed. If what I do does not make a difference to the life of Mrs. Cannybody, then probably I'm not doing it right, or I shouldn't be doing it at all. Because if it's not Mrs. Cannybody, then who is it? So we've got Mrs. Cannybody up in the top corner. She sees something bad's happening, think, oh my goodness, that's a bad thing that's coming down the road. I'm looking at the weather forecast. What shall I do? Something that's recent and relevant. I'm reading the newspapers and they're telling me that over the winter, my electricity is going to be switched off for 3-hour blocks of time. What am I going to do? How am I going to manage it? Her perspective about that bad thing is from a very personal level. She's thinking about how can I look after myself? Across, we've got the community. We think about the community of Durham. Think about the community of this college that we're in at the moment. What would happen here if electricity is off for 3 hours? How do we manage the fact that we'll get probably 6 or 7 hours notice that says, at 3:30, all the power's off and it's off for 3 hours? What would we do? How would we manage it? What would the impacts be? How do we talk to each other about it? How do we talk to the electricity companies that says, really, do you mind if you don't? How do we have those conversations that says, my area is more important than your area to have on electricity? How do we have those conversations? We've then got, in the bottom corner here, we've got the state, we've got local government, we've got national government. They have a very different perspective on what it is that's happening in that after-disaster space. The language that we use, the decisions that we make, the information that we make those decisions with. And I was very struck with Bruce's presentation just around how much information we hold, and we hold behind the doors. So we have the National Security Risk Assessment. And the National Security Risk Assessment is this very nice and glossy brochure that says, in the UK, these are the things that we need to be worried about. It's very nice and very glossy, and it tells you absolutely nothing. Because as a government, do we really want people to have that information? As an emergency planner, do I really want people to have information that's going to increase the worries that they have, that's going to increase the concerns that they have, and actually they can't do anything about it? Do I do that? Do I purposefully increase people's levels of anxiety? The challenge. And then we've got the research institutions. From the research, and this is the brave bit, and I am referencing where the fire exits are, given that I'm in a room full of researchers. There are times when researchers, the language that they use and the approach that they take doesn't necessarily really chime with the needs of Mrs. Cannybody up in the top corner. It doesn't help the community. It doesn't really help me as an emergency planner. I think, what is it? What's the best way to do things? What's the best way to manage it? So all of it's around how do we translate, how do we mediate, how do we move information and data from the people who have it to the people who need it? And when that information gets to them, can we get it to them in a way that enables them to act and to be able to move forward? Because when we start talking about sharing that information, and this is one of my favourite quote, and I was really disappointed when I looked this quote up and found that there actually isn't a map that says, there be dragons. I was devastated because I want there to be a map somewhere that says, over here there's this really scary thing. Because when we start talking to people about risk, when we start talking to people about what happens after the disaster, there absolutely is dragons. So what we have in the After Disasters Network, we're kind of here, and I was very good. I thought, Kate, be professional. Yeah, the last session on, kiddo. Make sure that you don't do anything that you're going to find professionally embarrassing. Like that's ever stopped me. What I wanted to put up was a jam sandwich, because that's kind of what the After Disasters Network is. We've got the slices of bread on the top and the bottom with the community and with the state and with policymakers, and we've got the research community on the bottom with academics and the research councils and the institutions that they're in. The After Disasters Network, we're a really very high-class strawberry jam, because what we do, we help those two pieces work together. And we've got a proper document that's got a list of objectives and things like that. But in essence, this is what it is that we're doing. We want to make friends in slow time. So far, I've already threatened to kidnap 3 people's brains that I've met during these past couple of days, because they've got stuff that, from my perspective, I need to know that. And I need to figure out how to take that and take it over here and make something good out of it. So we're making friends before we need them. We're developing wider networks. Because when disasters happen, we don't have time to go out and make those friends. I need to make sure that so for example, I ring Hannah at 2 o'clock in the morning and say, Hannah, need something? She's going to know who I am. She's going to trust that I'm ringing her for a purpose, and she's going to trust the information that I'm giving her. So we need to develop those networks. We need to bring the people into those networks to bring those multiple perspectives. We're directly supporting communities. Now, it's not just about the state directly supporting them through civil contingencies. This is about us helping those communities find their own voice. And that's a piece of work that I've been doing in the Falklands, Neil's been doing now, and it's primarily what Flora was doing when we were working down in Grenfell. So as part of the Grenfell response, Flora was embedded with communities. She was hearing the frustrations. She was hearing and seeing what was being done. And we were working through the network to try and get that information back up into the policy space so that we could change how we were working to make it slightly better. We're helping to amplify those quiet voices. As you may have noticed, I'm really not a shy retiring person that stands in the corner. I'm a bolshy old broad. I've been in emergency management for over 20 years now. I have got no difficulty having conversations with people who they might not like what it is I've got to say. I hopefully say I say it very nice. As a hint, if I turn up with Jaffa cakes, you're probably not going to like what it is I'm about to say to you. But we have to have those conversations. And as professionals, we need to be in that space to help mediate between the community and the people who are managing them. And then we've got that translation and sharing of expertise. Because again, we're looking to build a network, we're looking to get people involved, because each of us bring a small part of it. And that's hopefully how we're going to be managing it going forward. Now, this is the point where we hope the tech works. So I'm hoping that my colleague Neil Denton, who is at home with COVID, is about to start to present the next set of slides.
Hi, my name's Neil, and I've got COVID. Bear with me through this. I've tried to make the slides as text self-explanatory as possible, just in case I end up talking utter nonsense. This is a beautiful moment for me, because Kate is acting as my human clicker, which I think this is actually the moment where I have more power than I've ever had in terms of Kate. So let's try this. What I want to talk to us about today is the research that clearly demonstrates that community connection, collaboration and trust are crucial factors in disaster response, recovery and prevention. But as Bruce has alluded to in terms of how disaster then turns into development, I want to argue that they were also critical in making the good times better. I'm in accord with Colin from this morning in terms of the need to rethink resilience. And from my perspective, I would argue that peace is more than the absence of violence. I would therefore go on to suggest that resilience should be more than the ability to cope when bad things happen. And we'll explain a little bit why we think resilience should be reframed as relational, responsive and ready for anything. And then I'm going to leave us with some thoughts and suggestions that these implications go far beyond the disaster world and may guide us towards some universal solutions that may be hidden by what Hannah was referring to as the siloed problems, structures and systems. But to achieve that potential, we need to bottle the essence and dare to dream. And I think that means that we need to see the fish need to see the water. Next slide, please, Kate. My practice, I call myself a mediator actually. It's a mishmash of mediation, conflict transformation, peace building and non-violent communication. But most of the time, I want to make this work. I spend some of my time working within groups, trying to increase bonding capital with people who have a similar sense of identity or share similar circumstances. I spend a lot of my time working between groups who perceive themselves to be different and sometimes perceive themselves to be in conflict, and often that's quite violent. And I will help try and build bridges between those communities. But I also spend my time trying to improve the quality of dialogue between communities and those that have more access to power and resource. Next slide, please, Kate. And as Kate alluded, it was only when the flooding was happening in Newburn and the outer west of Newcastle that we really started to understand that what I was doing in terms of mediation could really work in terms of disaster. And you would think that we were drawn together through intellectual common endeavours. Actually, we were on the same corridor and their office had more biscuits. But the research clearly says that actually connected communities are better able to cope with the bad times. Next slide. Over the years, we've made quite good friends with Daniel Aldrich from Northeastern, and he's, from as far as I can find, done quite a lot of the work around social capital and disasters. And the research is quite startling. Based on the 2011 tsunami, he looked at levels of fatalities and levels of social connection in the towns that were along the coast and discovered that actually in terms of survival, community connections were more significant than the height of the sea wall or the wave in terms of the number of deaths incurred. And that difference was a factor of 10. Next slide. But we also know that connected communities recover better. Studies from Kobe in Japan, Tamil Nadu in India, and where Kate was referencing in terms of New Orleans, both between each other and within those populations, we can demonstrate that recovery from natural and other disasters does not depend on the overall amount of aid received, nor the amount of damage done by the disaster. Instead, social capital, the bonds which tie its citizens together, functions as the engine of long-term recovery. Next. But it doesn't matter how clever or persuasive the research is if it doesn't lead to change, if it doesn't support practice, and if it doesn't help the doers do it better. And to do that, we need to understand things from the different perspectives that Kate was talking about. I'm listening in, so I couldn't see the audience, but whoever it was that asked the question to Sim about the difference between warnings versus forecasts. We need to understand how what we're saying is being heard and received. I always love listening to Hannah, and it's a clear indication that it's not about what's important to us, it's what's important to people. We may be desperate to talk about earthquakes, but if everyone else is talking tigers, it's not going to make for a great conversation. The Relationships Project, of which I'm an associate, aims to build a better society by building better relationships. They dream of a world where relationships are the first mile and not the extra mile. And as the name suggests, they've got a lot of friends. When COVID happened, they held a space for people across the UK who were involved in helping their neighbours and communities. From those leading the emergent mutual aid groups, to those in more established voluntary community organisations, from those in faith groups, from local government. And what we created was a space to come together, to help people make sense of what was going on, and to support each other. An intentional space where the helpers could receive help. A space to provide the three most important things you need to hear when bad things happen. We're here, you are not alone, and we will get through this together. They asked me to support these sessions, and obviously I jumped at the chance. And this has been an ongoing relationship with lots of folk I've never met apart from on a screen, which is odd. But what we've tried to do is bring together that sense of peer support with some expert input and some practical resources, with a deliberate intention to energise, inspire and support. Next, please. So obviously we called on Kate to say, tell us what this normally looks like. Let's explain this. Let's push what we know from the research out into the community to help them get a sense of what usually happens. This may not be unprecedented to us, but to the people experiencing it, it absolutely was. And we supported them, next slide, to use those models and really adapt them to what we were seeing and hearing in our own communities. And to start to put time stamps on those and to see where we were and what the impact was. Next. And within those spaces, we listened to stories of darkness and also identified points of light. And we tried to move those into themes that made sense to people and provide support. We've mused over many things. In the sad times, next slide, we hear and we continue to hear that there's so much pain still being carried, grief not yet metabolised. Thousands of stories of loved ones taken away before their time, with hands not held and last words left unspoken and unheard. But we also heard from the helpers and from the professionals, so many that have given so much but are exhausted, that their tanks are running on empty and that fuel is in short supply. So we're working with them to think about how do we make the time in this frantic world to repair, to regroup and refocus. It is not just points of light that brings communities together. We come together in our sad moments. I think we can see from the death of the Queen and the queue that these can be real catalysts to bring people together. So we've been exploring how we can remake grief a part of the commons. And we're also working with colleagues from Kate's Trust and across the UK to think, how can we recalibrate mental health support away from a crisis intervention and towards an upstream day-to-day part of community activity. Next slide. And what we also heard, with the social distancing, with the emergent blame of outgroups that happened, that whereas bonding capital was up in many communities because we were helping each other, we were understanding our neighbours, getting to know them better, the bridging capital, the relationships between groups, was breaking down. So one of the things we did is try and download my brain into a step-by-step guide. That was not fun. And explain to people how some of the tools and approaches I use could be applied in a day-to-day setting. So how we equip people to think like a mediator and build bridges in your community. And like Bruce, we agreed that this actually needs to be out there without any restrictions, no paywalls, no nothing, it's out. It's been downloaded more than 4,000 times. And we've worked with dozens of communities across the UK, but also in Nigeria, Australia, bits of the US, helping them to understand how they can build bridges between their communities. Next, please. But in the midst of our worst times, we caught a glimpse of our best selves. A disaster encourages us to see a problem that's bigger than all of us and to reach out and help out. It gives us permission to trespass across the normal social divides that we have. So we're working at the moment to say, as we remember what we lost, how do we remember what we discovered? And how do we memorialise the moments and memories of hope and solidarity and use that energy to create movements? Next, please. So we know that connected communities are better able to cope in bad times. But connected communities are better able to make the most of good times. And we've been struggling to try and articulate what we think we've learned over the last 3 years and how these things come together. We've recently published, next please, our best attempt. That's probably mean it's not very good, but our attempt to articulate what's going on, which we're calling the sense of connection. And what we think we're seeing, next slide, is that relationships power a virtual circle of thriving in good times and supporting each other in bad. That our strong relationships and connections mean that we cope well with disaster, we recover better from disaster, and through that process of working together, solving problems that we all share, but in ways that also build human relationships, we build what everybody else calls resilience for future shock. Next, please. And by doing that, we move disaster response in terms of the short-term fix into a medium-term repair, and by embedding it with other skills from community development and other colleagues and people within those communities into a long-term build. Next slide. And that's because relationships, we think, sit at the heart of disaster recovery, community development and conflict transformation. Next slide. But even within these three fields, we've realised that we use different words to describe the same thing, same words to describe different things. So I'm firmly in Bruce's 1F 6% and respondent 345s category on this one. Next. But ours is only a small piece of the jigsaw in terms of bringing those things together. If successful disaster response, attention to division and long-term community building are all underpinned by social capital, I would suggest we need to start stitching together what we intuitively know about building good relationships, place by place, and that by doing so we can reveal a bigger picture of the fundamental components and enablers of a strong community. However, the research in this is massively disparate and incredibly difficult to meaningfully connect. And that's where we need your help. We heard from Sim that the warnings rely on being personalised and trusted to be acted upon. From Colin, that his brilliant system around insurance worked until it got to the local official and then got a bit fuzzy when the official only rang a couple of people. Over the last 2 days, I didn't realise I needed a moral and political philosopher in my life until I listened to Elizabeth and started to think about triage ethics. And I was fairly certain I didn't need a particle physicist with a supercomputer until I heard from Frank. But if I'd given him a ring before deciding to spend Friday night in the busy pub, I might be with you in person today. Next slide. When things keep breaking, it's sometimes better to think about redesign than repair. And I'm suggesting it's time for a new conversation. Because we won't meet the challenges of next year, let alone the next generation, with a continuing approach to our shared lives that is bureaucratic and codified, defensive, distrusting and fearful, transactional, centralised and impersonal. I suggest it's time for us to focus instead on the primacy of relationships between citizens, a world characterised by kindness, solidarity and trust. Now, such a shift is not going to be without risk, but how much better would it be to get the right behaviours wrong every now and then, rather than hobble on, getting the wrong behaviours right over and over again. And we will not achieve any of the development goals, any collective ways to navigate through climate change, through a world of increasingly complex hazards, or build a society where we want our grandchildren to thrive in without a focus on relationships. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Neil. And I'd just like to say that I was not in charge of the clicker, but I had, because apparently we didn't have to click on those slides. But hopefully everybody who was online saw the slides as we were managing it through. We are happy to take questions. I'm not quite sure how we'll manage the questions between Neil and I, but if we've got questions online or we've got questions in the room, happy to take them as they come out.
So the question I want to ask was about the sketch of the remodel towards the end. What role do you see sort of state officials and government playing in that better way?
That's a Neil one.
So I see the world in 3 parts. I see doers, I see thinkers, and I see enablers. Now, I don't think that the state can create social capital, but can absolutely create the conditions where social capital is more likely to develop and thrive. So I'm working with colleagues in Portugal, and we're exploring how Gaia, which is kind of like the gateshead to Porto, how we can build a relational-based city. So we're talking there with not only educators, but also urban and physical designers, how we're transforming some of the health services to be moving to a much more relational rather than a transactional model. So yeah, hopefully that's an answer. I think they are vital to this piece, but it's about enabling those conditions to thrive.
Thank you very much for that. Another question or comment?
So this is maybe a simple question, but I'm a data scientist, so I'm wondering, how do you measure connections and how do you measure the strength of connections?
Good question. There are quite a lot of proxies that a couple of people like me, so Daniel knows more about this than me, but proxies about connection within groups, so number of people engaged in neighbourhood activities, in local voluntary associations. There are proxies about civic engagement in terms of people engaging with consultation exercises, and there are indicators about groups coming together, so there are indicators in terms of bridging. What we tend to do though, we've got something we call the relationships heat map that we work with organisations to let them help think through where there are strong relations in their organisations and when there aren't. And I use a conflict mapping tool with communities that really need help to understand who's who, how they group, who's got power, and how the relationships, either positive or destructive, exist between them. And from there we can start to get a sense of what the changes we want to see and how we start to build closer ties and collaborations.
Anybody else comment or question? Okay, Neil, I have a question for you. How similar or different was COVID to natural hazard disaster events?
Everybody was affected. So all of our helpers were also our victims or sufferers or whatever you want to call them. And that's been a really tricky thing for people, and I think that's been doubly exhausting for people. There is no outside team that you can drag in to a pandemic that says we're not affected by this, but we're prepared to come into this space, which we can then leave and recharge. And I think that's been a massive difference. I also think it's the amount of physical separation that we've had to do, and in some places we've done that brilliantly. Kate and colleagues in the South Pacific started asking and both questions in terms of physically protected and socially connected. We did not do that here, and we are suffering for it.
Right. Thank you very much for that, Neil.